Hello once again everyone, another week, another video, and today we're going to be talking about a very important subject, which is pommeling without pummeling. So, what does that mean? That means we're going to be talking all about the context of pommels, how they're launched, how you defend yourself from them, and we're going to focus on the modern context as opposed to the historical one, because there's some things we need to take into account in regards to how we make things safe to practice with other people. And for that, I brought another person who I really don't want to break. This is Luke. I think he's been on the channel before at least once or twice. But first things first, pommels. How safe are they to throw? What should you be aware of when you're throwing a pommel? First thing is, there aren't really very many safe versions of pommels. Certainly not on anything you're going to be sparring with outside of armor. I mean, we have the Morschlag swords that I mentioned, but you're not going to be sparring with those in Bloss, so it's going to be steel pretty much the whole time. And there really isn't a way to make that safe without ruining the balance of the sword. It is a dense steel ball on the end of a tang, which does not flex at all, and it doesn't take much to really hurt someone. Pommels don't have to be launched with a ton of force. You'll usually see boom when it comes to, theatrical depictions, but it really doesn't take a lot to mess up someone's day, even if they're wearing a fencing mask. So, when would you throw a pommel? Pommels are usually going to be thrown when you close in. So, we'll go over some examples of when throwing a pommel is a good idea and when throwing a pommel is not as good of an idea. So, at the moment, Luke and I are both standing, decently close. This is much closer than I would like to be without my sword having hit him. But at this point, I could look for maybe closing in or leaving. That's up to me. I'm well within, past the Zufect and into the Krieg. I need to make my decision. But if we end up in a sort of bind, okay, could I throw a pommel here? Well, my point isn't lined up with him, so this end does make a little bit more sense. However, there's quite a lot of distance for me to cover, and my sword isn't necessarily out of the equation, neither is his. So, the better option in this sort of situation is probably to fight with the blades, and consider that, or to change the situation. So, at the moment, if I were to just go for pommel, Luke's blade is still very much free. He can just drop it down onto my head, and we'll show that. It's not hard for him to get me way before I get him, and I am definitely getting the worst of that deal. However, to maybe make my situation a little bit better, I've raised my guard upward. This is basically like me grabbing hold of the sword. Now I'm not worried about that coming over as much. He still can, absolutely. But to perform that successfully, he'll also need to be gaining distance as I move in, so I can take that away from him. So now, this situation, because I've changed it, the pommel makes a lot more sense. Let's look at another one. Okay? So this situation, kind of same idea, but a little bit different. Neither of us has the immediate advantage at the moment. However, if I were to think, oh, I should go for a pommel here, yes, I can reach out and grab. I can also slide up and control. There's some issues here, though. Last time, I was more off to the left, which meant that it was very easy for me to employ the pommel, which is guided by your offhand. This time, I'm much more on the right, which means that that option isn't there without going underneath the sword. Not what I want to do. Now, I could try and do the same trick I did earlier and raise up with my crossguard, but because of the bind we're in, my pommel can really only go that way again, so that's not really apparent. I'd have to turn my sword over, and that's not going to work. Could I use my hand? Absolutely. I can grab hold, and then I do have opportunity, but should I go for a pommel here? The answer is no, because I could go for the sword instead. I don't even have to do anything terribly fancy with that. Alternatively, since I am here anyway, there's no reason I shouldn't just keep working on the blade, right? Something along those lines. Now maybe when he, deals with this point, there's my pommel. Now, these are just two situations of the innumerable ones you could end up in. But basically, the point of it is, make sure that there is a controlling factor and that you have seized the vor in some way or other. So that first one, that was a moment of, we came in, we're both in Indes, I changed the game, taking the vor and changing the situation to my betterment. Second one, same idea, I just did so with the point of my sword rather than my crossguard. Pommel is to be thought of as something that you've planned ahead, not something you just do. Now another thing to consider is that at this distance, throwing a pommel is not that difficult. All it takes is one passing step. A little bit further out, I should be focusing on the blade. Pommel should not even really be on my mind. In fact, at this range, when it comes to doing things, the only thing I really have to grab is very close to the tip of his sword, which, don't get me wrong, this is shown. Fiore specifically shows this kind of action. And it's not that hard to do safely without cutting yourself. It does, however, lend to a danger, which, let's see if you remember it, Luke. If someone grabs the tip of your sword, what do?
Oh no.
You've got this, come on.
Okay. You can grab theirs?
You can grab theirs, but there's a faster option.
Okay.
There it is.
There it is. Okay.
Simpler is better, my boy.
Yeah.
So, basically, anytime someone grabs the tip of your sword, they are leaving themselves in an excellent position to just have their hand controlled a little bit like a grip. So, for example, hold out your arm, right? If we have this and I grab hold of his fingertips, I can move this rather significantly because I've got control. However, when it comes to someone grabbing the tip of your sword, basically the same thing is still true. It's just rather than the person who grabbed having the control, it's the person who has the sharp thing. It's very easy for me to move him and just pluck it out of his hand. And even with gloves, I can put force into it that is gonna suck, and his lizard brain is gonna be screaming at him the whole time, let go of the sword. So generally anybody grabbing here, you just need to gain distance and get away, and you're gonna escape. So again, pommels are not really becoming apparent. But just for sake of funsies, let's go back to that double sword grab, right? So we're here, and he's grabbed it back. This does come up, mostly in armor. Is the pommel the best idea now? I have seen this happen before where people will try to step forward, but you notice I can't actually hit him with my pommel. Instead, I'm hitting with the crossguard, and that is a surefire way to get banned from every tournament you've ever wanted to go to. At this situation, wrestling is your best option, or things along those lines. And that's really the tricky one when it comes to pommels, is deciding when a pommel is your best bet versus wrestling. Generally, because I'm a little more wrestling inclined, I err on the side of wrestling. However, when it comes to fighting opponents I don't want to grapple, I will go for the pommel. It's a case-by-case basis. A great example would be if you are a shorter fighter and you're fighting some 6'6" guy, and you can't even reach his head, just go ahead and discount pommels. Probably not going to work too well for you. But usually, pommels are going to be a move past them sort of action, as opposed to a stay in the fight. So a lot of people will think about pommels in regards to, we'll just come to a bind, right? This, boom, 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 and we're staying in distance here. But the longer you stay here, the easier it is for him to defend, because he has options, and we will go over them. Usually when it comes to launching a pommel, what you want to do instead is make it nice, quick, dirty, and keep moving. Because once you bring this forward, all of this is behind you, and it can't do much for you except the ponytail protect, right? Which I will talk about at some point. But, so think of pommels more as a, and keep going, as opposed to a dramatic fight ender. That's what thrusts are for. So, now that we've got a little bit of understanding, let's talk about the different types of pommels. There are 4, technically 5, but 4 general styles of pommel. They are uppercut, in which I lever. They are the hook, usually done from your offside to your dominant side. Not that you can't hook this way, but it's a lot easier, makes a lot more sense, and also usually you're going to end up in a bind where you're getting that pressure. So generally I think of the hook being on your non-dominant side. So boom. You have your straight pop, which can be done either with both hands, or usually it's done with one hand controlling. And then you have your smash, which is straight over the top, straight down. Now, the 5th pommel that kind of is between them all is kind of like the straight mixed with the smash. It's for when you end up in a kind of the open sort of grip. So let's show those with context now. So here's when to do them and when they pop up. So we come to a close bind. If Luke brings his sword straight back, right? You see how he's opening this little gap for me? That's when you fill it with the uppercut. Boom. So show that again. He raises up. Boom. Okay? And it's not really a true uppercut per se. It's really more, that's the line it's taking. then I pop forward. And remember, when it comes to doing a pommel in sparring, a tap is good. No one's, in regards to like tournament, is going to ignore that. And if they do, the fighter is going to be appreciative that you didn't just take his teeth out. So, that's the uppercut. The hook is for when he pushes me off to this side. Boom. Okay? Now the uppercut targeted about here, not his actual chin. I went for about here. The hook I'm targeting kind of about where his cheek is, as opposed to the side of his head. This is just so that way he rolls a little easier as opposed to that sort of compacting happening. So here's that again. Boom, he pushes me off to the side. My arm actually moves. This is light and airy. Boom, no problem. Next up is the straight. This one can kind of be done mostly whenever, but it's usually when you have control. So I've got him in the moment. I'm going to release with one hand, grab hold of his wrist, his forearm, his cross guard, and I'm just going to pull his sword down against my sword, which pushes my pommel forward, and then I can just do the straight. Now, I like to do it with a step past him, so that way in case something goes wrong, we end up in wrestling. But you don't have to move at all. This is more than enough, and usually makes it so that everyone can see what just happened. So, here's that with the grab again, and then without a grab. Boom, and then without a grab. Same idea. Now, the over the top, a little bit more rare. Usually what it happens is either there's a serious height difference, which Luke and I don't have, but we will show again in a moment, or one fighter has left the bind in an attempt to grab a leg or something, which kind of forces a height difference anyway. So we're here, Luke tries to go low for me in general. This is where we get the over the top smash. Now, that one's probably the most dangerous to do out of all of them. The hook, you can accidentally put too much power into it. The uppercut, you could catch them right underneath the chin and their mouth is open. But those things are things you can practice / just bad luck, right? The straight, that one's pretty hard to mess up. Smashing, though, it's a very primal thing, and especially when you start, the lizard brain is like, smash, and you kind of forget yourself. So, when it comes to bringing it straight down, especially in that grabbing around the waist sort of situation, this will happen to you. I guarantee it. What causes this is usually one fencer thinks they know how to wrestle, or maybe they even do, and they're going for your leg or they're going around their middle, and either they don't manage to pick you up or something along those lines. What is your best option here? Your best option, since your sword is up and clear, is to pommel. Absolutely, that is the best thing to do, and we know that would knock his lights out. What I'd really recommend you do is when this happens, get yourself a nice base so you're not going to be thrown anywhere. Get eye contact with as many people as you can and show this, okay? Doesn't have to be anything dramatic, just show that you could pommel. You don't want to be making contact if you can help it. If no one's calling it and you're doing this, yell out pommel. If they still won't give you the point, go home with the moral victory. Don't worry about it. Because there are some things you're going to have to just let go. Never resort to, all right, I guess I'm going to hit him harder because the judges didn't see it. We have had that happen in HEMA. We really need to stop it happening. Just let it go. It's not life or death. Now, another note, by the way, just in regards to grappling in general, is you can force that situation in a way, especially if you're up against a shorter fighter. What I like to do to force that is I will push their sword very far to this side, which tells you to do what? No, come on, what are you actually going to do if I do that? Yeah, he'll bring in something along these lines. Great situation for you to grab, pull down, and you've got free reign over them. And if they take off against you, same idea. So you can force these situations a little bit. So those are our 4 basic pommels. So to review real quick, we've got uppercut when they pull back, hook when they push over, straight when you're taking the initiative, and then slam when they have left the bind, right? Or you have forced them to leave it. So, now we've got the basic idea of those, let's talk a little bit about defending against them. So, the trick for defending against a pommel can vary. It really depends. Oh, I suppose we ought to go over the 5th. Let's go over the 5th pommel. I keep forgetting that. So that one comes off of when you're on this side. So we saw that situation earlier. It's whenever you grab someone's sword their grip or their arm or something along those lines, and you end up here. Like I said, usually best option is just to cut or thrust or anything along those lines, but sometimes for sake of speed, maybe he's coming forward, something along those lines, the pommel becomes the most apparent option. That's fine. That pommel will still work, and it certainly looks great. The biggest downside of this pommel is that it's coming from the side that his free hand is on. It is not hard for him to put things between me and my objective. Now, that ends us basically in the situation like we had when we both grabbed the sword tips, where now we're essentially in a wrestling match. And this is where it's going to end up most times, right? Unless you're fighting someone who is just brand new, or maybe you even managed to grab their backhand. I have had that happen. Usually, they're going to at least get their arm up in front. And if he, telephone blocks or something along those lines, and I just thunk onto his arm, that's not going to end the fight. It sucks, don't get me wrong, but we know that's not going to drop him. The object is the head. So, that's why generally I'm not a fan of that one. Does it come up? Yes, but it's not something I would actively say go for. If you're in that situation, try to use the tip of the sword. Okay, so now let's talk about defending them, and I kind of unintentionally previewed that with that, which is the idea of blocks versus mullering. So mullering is the term that I, for no particular reason, gave to shrugging off incoming pommels, and I'll also show you how to drill mullering. But first, let's talk about blocks. So when it comes to Schwertnehmen in the German system, which is the sword takings, pretty much they all just devolve into dagger plays, because if we look at it, when Luke launches, especially a straight or something along those lines at me, it's basically the same length and general attack coming in as a dagger, right? Nothing all that much has changed, which means that all my usual dagger blocks will work without difficulty. The most important thing to remember is how you are restricted via your gear. So, for example, grabbing and doing all that is easy when I am barehanded, but if I'm in heavies, that becomes a little trickier. Especially if I'm wearing all this stuff like Luke has on his arms, it's a little bit harder for me to get this out and where I need it to be very quickly. So, usually your otherwise pretty dagger plays are not going to be all that pretty, and you're going to end up looking like you learned how to knife fight in Mordor. That's okay. Because end of the day, it's about not getting hit. So, for example, Luke's coming over with something. I may very well end up with what is essentially me blocking with the forearm, and that's okay. Notice that I am still filling the gap and trying to push this up and away if I can. At this point, where I have blocked, my object should be to get good control back onto my sword and to get distance, or to wrestle. Now, wrestling at this point wouldn't be the worst idea in the world. Probably ought to just ditch my sword for it, have, two hands on him versus he's still worried about that. However, usually, for most people, I would advocate getting distance instead. So at this point, once you've blocked, you need to roll his sword away from you. So I've blocked it above his head, I'm going to push it off away from me and away from my sword. Step away. Now I have my hit. Now, when it comes to rolling off, it's always going to be the opposite direction of where your arm came from. So if the pommel came in this side, I blocked with this arm, which means I want it to go back where it came from. Step away in the same way with wide triangle steps, and you'll pretty much always escape. Now, let's talk about mullering versus blocking. Mullering is a little bit different. It's where I keep both hands on the sword, and I'm using my elbows a little bit more. Same idea, I am just rolling them off side to side, and we'll just show a couple so you get an example. Step a little bit over this way so you don't go off the edge. So I use both arms to push, I get my distance. In this case it ended up at more as a static block, so I get away. And notice that I'm always exiting off to the side. I never want to exit straight back, because this is what will happen. So I blocked it, great, grand, wonderful. He's pushing in, but the more dangerous thing is if I step back, all he has to do is bring his sword straight down on top of my head. It's like the barrel of a gun. I want to be away from it, not in front of it. All right, let's throw a different pommel. So suppressing down, great opportunity, things along those lines. So you kind of get the idea. Usually you're going to end up using your right elbow. Sometimes you'll end up using your left. Just kind of depends upon what they're throwing at you. But the trick with it is you're just raising your arms out and essentially causing their incoming strike to skip over your head or be pushed back and crumpled. If it just stops, also great. So that's kind of what mullering is, and here's a drill to practice it. So what you do is you got fencer A, fencer B. In my case, I am fencer A. I'm going to be pommeling Luke. So we make sure we're at good distance. You cut, and then you're both going to advance as one to the point you're in grapple distance. Now at this point, several things will happen. For example, in this case, both our arms went high, so it's that that uppercut for me. If, for example, this had happened, I'd probably need to go for this. If this had happened, there's my hook. It's whatever. It will vary from time to time. But as fencer A, my job is to try and hit Luke. So I try and hit Luke, and he uses his mullering to get away from me. Now, a bad Luke did that you want to focus on is, what do you do after you've gotten away? Okay? Number one, get yourself facing your opponent so that way they don't do anything stupid and beam you in the back of the head. So always make sure you're facing them. Number two, do you hit them? That's the tricky one, because the answer is both yes and no. So sometimes mullering will put you in a position where basically the back of their head is exposed. This happens a lot when you parry with your left arm. So we come in, we're here, and I end up over here, right? In this situation, we'll have you keep facing that way just for sake of. This can happen, just need to replicate it. But if you end up in this sort of position, you're going to be tempted as all hell to cut him. The trick with it is, remember, the fencing mask ends right there. This is all just scrum cap and back of head protector. I do not want to brain him, okay? If I miss, that's bare neck right there, right? If I hit his shoulder or something along those lines, it's not as many points. So there's that temptation of, well, what do I do, right? The best thing I recommend you do is just extend your point and let him turn into it. Will you always hit him? No. However, quite a few judges and refs have started erring on the side of a presented threat as opposed to an actual hit in some regards. So for example, I have seen this happen at a tournament. It was very well done, where a guy came in, he went to half sword, wrestled him away, and just presented it. He didn't stab him in the back of the head. He just showed, I could. And they gave him the points, and I think that was 100% justified. Because, end of the day, we're not fighting to the death. None of us are training to fight to the death, right? Some of us may think we are, but we are not. We all want to go home, we all want to fence some more, so we all need to be safe. So, in that situation, where someone comes in, you muller them to the side, and you're off to behind them, just step back, present the threat, maybe even make it look like a cut, but don't finish. That should get you points in most people's books. It certainly will get you bragging rights, and it will look really cool on video. But that's the basics of pommeling without pummeling and the approach you should have to it. So real quick review. Number one, a touch or just miming is more than good enough. Always go to the front of the head / the top of the head if you can. Don't want to be hitting back here. Don't want to be catching them around here. Make sure that you are in control of their weapon in some way. If they are coming in with the pommel against you, blocking and rolling is what you want. Get distance, keep facing them, present a threat as opposed to beaming them in the back of the head. And that's just a general overview. Like I said, take this drill, practice with it, work with it, and eventually moving like that will just become second nature, and you'll start shrugging things off. But otherwise, thank you very much, Luke, and we'll go over some other techniques another time.